is celebrating this Last Supper with his disciples and is being nailed to a wooden cross at Calvary. There were his ardent prayers in the Garden of Gethsemane, his arrest and the accompanying desertion by his disciples, his trials before the Sanhedrin, before Pilate, before Herod, before Pilate again, Peter's denial, the beating from the Roman soldiers, and the journey with the cross to the place of execution. But still, the span of time between Jesus celebrating his Last Supper and his being nailed to the cross at Golgotha was very short. Literally hours separated those two events. Thanks to modern science, we know much more about the experience of crucifixion, what it does to the human body, than at any other time. Of course, I'm not going to go into all the details. We're a mixed crowd this morning, and so that would not be appropriate. Plus, with the way I'm feeling, having just celebrated communion, I don't think I could handle that emotionally. But I will tell you one thing. It's now believed that people who are crucified ultimately succumb to asphyxiation, which is a condition of extreme decrease of levels of oxygen in the body and extreme increase of the levels of carbon dioxide. And the result of this imbalance is unconsciousness and then eventual death. The way the body hangs when it's nailed on a wooden cross makes breathing very laborious and painful. In fact, the only way to get each breath, if you're hanging like that, is to push up with your legs so that you can get enough air in your diaphragm. And because your feet are nailed to the cross, that means that you have to inflict pain on yourself, lift your body for every single breath. Eventually, victims are so overcome by exhaustion that they're unable to lift themselves any longer. They suffocate or they poison themselves because they're unable to replace carbon dioxide with the oxygen that the body needs. So when a person is approaching asphyxiation, breathing itself becomes next to impossible. Not to mention the additional pain that would be required if you were to even attempt to speak a word, to get enough oxygen in your lungs to speak. And so we can safely conclude that any word that Jesus would have spoken from the cross would be a word worth reflecting on. And if you look at the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it appears that Jesus made 7 unique statements from the cross, what are now referred to as the 7 statements from the cross. And because these words are precious, we're going to end our time together this morning by looking at each one just briefly. The first word.
Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know of what they do."
Jesus says this first word after the soldiers have nailed him to the cross at Golgotha. They're crucifying him with 2 other criminals, one on his left and the other on his right. And the timing of this statement suggests that Jesus asks the Father to forgive primarily his enemies, the soldiers who've just mocked him and pressed a crown of thorns into his skull and who have beaten him and who have now just nailed him to the cross. But could this word not also apply to his disciples who had deserted him? To Peter, who had denied him 3 times? To the fickle crowd who days before were praising him but now were condemning him to death? Could these words not also apply to us, as we so often forget Jesus in our daily lives? Does Jesus react angrily to the soldiers? No. He asks his Father in heaven to forgive them because they're ignorant. They don't know what they're doing. At the height of his physical suffering, divine love prevails, and Jesus asks the Father to forgive his enemies. Amazing. Right up to his final hours on earth, Jesus preached forgiveness. He teaches forgiveness in the Lord's Prayer when he says, "Forgive us our trespasses," or our sins, as we forgive those who sin against us. Also, when asked by Peter, the disciple, how often we should be tempted or encouraged to forgive our enemies, he says 70 times 7. At the Last Supper, which we just read about, Jesus explains his crucifixion to his disciples when he tells them to drink the cup. He says, "Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for the forgiveness of sins." He forgives the paralytic at Capernaum, the woman caught in the act of adultery, even as her accusers were preparing to stone her. And even following the resurrection, one of Jesus' first acts was to forgive Peter, who had denied him 3 times, and reinstate him as a disciple. The second word.
Jesus answered, "Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise."
Apparently the soldiers and the religious leaders aren't the only ones to mock Jesus. One of the criminals who is accused and crucified alongside him starts to hurl insults as well. Again, does Jesus react angrily? No, he remains silent. But the criminal on Jesus' right speaks up for him, explaining that he and the other criminal are receiving their just due. And then looking to Jesus, he says, "This man has done nothing wrong." And then he asks Jesus this question: "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." What incredible faith this repentant criminal had. Far more, presumably, than Thomas, one of Jesus' own disciples. Ignoring his own suffering, Jesus responds graciously with the second word. The second word, again, is a word of forgiveness, this time directed toward a convicted criminal. Jesus shows his divinity by opening the doors of heaven to a man who asked only to be remembered. His third word.
Then Jesus said to his mother, "Woman, this is your son." And he said to the disciple, "This is your mother."
Jesus and his mother Mary were together at the start of his public ministry in Cana. And here, at the end of his public ministry, Mary is with her son again. Any parent in this room knows we can't stand to see our kids in pain. I'll never forget the first real injury Eric, my son, had. It was the summer of his second year, and he had not long before learned how to not only walk, but pull himself up and run. And he's running down the sidewalk in front of our house, and you know what's going to come next, right? The slabs of sidewalk weren't quite lined up, and so he stubbed his toe and went flying onto the concrete. And sure enough, an x-ray revealed that he had a broken toe. And my initial feeling watching that in slow motion was that I was a failure. But I shouldn't have let that happen to my son. Multiply that by 10,000. What sorrow must fill Mary's mother heart to see her son mocked and tortured and beaten. What sorrow must fill her mother heart as she watches Jesus' lifeblood drain from his body. Simeon's prophecy comes true as a sword pierces Mary's soul. Jesus' third word to his mother Mary and his disciple John, the only eyewitness of the crucifixion of the 4 gospel writers. As before, Jesus rises above the occasion. His concerns are for his loved ones, for his mother, and for her care after he's gone. And who better to care for her than John, the beloved disciple, the only disciple that we're aware of who stayed near Jesus during his crucifixion. The fourth word.